Continuous traps, the gift that keeps on giving. Or in this case, the curse that keeps on taking up space in your back row. Today, we're going to be digging through the absolute bottom of the barrel to find the 10 worst continuous traps from the game's early days. Cards so bad, you're better off having a blank instead. And at number 10, we have Solemn Wishes. This is a continuous trap which allows you to gain 500 life points each time you draw one or more cards. Unlike in some other games, life gain has always been really terrible at Yu-Gi-Oh! It doesn't help that Konami has been extremely stingy with it too, as we can see with this card. 500 life points is just a ridiculously paltry amount, especially when you consider you have to set this card for a turn and wait until your next draw phase to actually get anything. It doesn't even have the decency of giving you 500 per card drawn, so even triggering a graceful charity with it won't feel good, as you'd only get 500 for the entire draw. You'd have to go through quite some trouble to trigger this 2 or 3 times. And even then, that would just be 1500 life points, which gets wiped out basically with every beater that decks played back then. At that point, playing a battle trap and actually dealing with your opponent's monster would end up saving you much more life in the long run. They could easily triple this card's life point gain amount, and it still wouldn't be as good as other battle stoppers at stalling a game. Still, the fact that this is a card that just kind of hangs around and does something that's technically beneficial for you without asking for some huge cost already makes it better than many other cards in here, so it doesn't deserve to be any lower than 10. And at number 9, we've got Regulation of Tribe. This continuous trap lets you declare one monster type, and monsters of that type cannot attack. To keep this card in the field though, you must tribute one monster during each of your standby phases, otherwise this card is destroyed. The Regulation of the Tribe is a card that vastly overestimates how good it is. The effect is middling at best, but they still felt the need to slap a tribute cost on it every single standby phase for you to reap its benefits, no matter how little they are. Stopping all monsters of a certain type from attacking is not that bad of an effect, but it's not good either. Most decks back then played a mishmash of various types, so it would probably be way better if it let you call all attributes instead. Sure, you could probably wall off a beatdown deck by calling Warrior a decent amount of the time, but you would still just be one Breaker the Magical Warrior or Kyuko the Ghost Destroyer away from getting your face smashed in anyway. But all of this would have been acceptable if it wasn't for that heavy cost every standby phase, since it essentially takes away the best thing about a card like this, protecting your board from being removed in battle. If you really wanted this kind of effect, there are many better cards that do what it wants to do but better. With Gravity Bind and Level Limit Area B, the overwhelming majority of monsters in people's decks were level 4 or higher after all, and they weren't going to be destroying themselves in a turn or two when you can't tribute any more monsters off your board either. And at number 8, we have the First Sarcophagus. This is a continuous trap that has you place the second sarcophagus and then the third sarcophagus from your hand or deck onto the field during each of your opponent's end phases. If any of the sarcophagus cards are removed from the field, all of them are sent to the graveyard. If you control all 3, you send them all to the graveyard to special summon one Spirit of the Pharaoh from your hand or deck. The first sarcophagus, the second sarcophagus, and the third sarcophagus are a really weird series of continuous spells and traps. It's like they looked at Destiny board and thought the idea was so good they just had to try it again, but this time requiring only 3 turns rather than 5 to be completed. They also thought this was enough of a change to where they could downgrade the payoff from letting you win the game to letting you play Spirit of the Pharaoh instead. This is a monster with 2500 attack and 2000 defense that, on summon, brings back up to 4 level 2 or lower zombie normal monsters from your graveyard. Its only other effect is preventing you from summoning it in other ways unless you use a sarcophagi, which in case you got any funny ideas about actually bringing this card out in a halfway decent manner. It's also important to remember that it says normal monsters and only from your graveyard, so you better make sure you can set that up while your spells hang around on the field doing nothing. They somehow thought this was good enough to print a couple of new normal zombies alongside this, only for them both to be outclassed by a literal clown that would come out only a year after release. Fittingly so, because that's what you were if you were still trying to make the first sarcophagus work all this time later. And at number 7, we have Robbin Zombie. This is a continuous trap with the effect that each time one of your monsters inflicts battle damage to your opponent sends the top card of their deck to the graveyard. Although milling or decking out has been somewhat viable a bunch of times in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, it was never because of cards like this. It didn't take very many years after the game came out for there to be multiple ways for decks to take advantage of having full graveyards, which always made this strategy extremely risky. That's why the only couple of ways this archetype has ever succeeded was to either try and mill the opponent entirely within a single turn, like with the Empty Jar combo, or to banish the cards instead. As you can see, this card does neither. It also has the same issue as Solemn Wishes in that they gave you a ridiculously weak effect up front. A single card out of the 35 your opponent is going to have in their deck is just ridiculous. Even if you're hitting them with 5 monsters every turn, it would still take ages to actually mill them out. Not to mention that if you're doing that, they will probably be dead long before that point anyway. Robbin Goblin, the card which inspired this one, discards a random card from your opponent's hand each time they take battle damage instead. And even turning all of your monsters into Spirit Reapers wasn't enough to let it see competitive play. This manages to be even worse than the other retrains the card has had, Hard Selling Goblin and Hard Selling Zombie, since they can at least in theory be a bit more troublesome to your opponent at times. With Robbin Zombie, you're going to be doing them a favor by setting up their graveyard each and every time you get some damage. And next up at number 6, we have Prepare to Strike Back. This continuous trap card forces a coin toss each time your opponent attacks a face-up defense position monster you control. If you call it right, the attack target is changed to attack position. If you call it wrong, you take damage equal to the difference between the attacking monster's attack and the defending monster's defense. There's just so much wrong with this card, it's hard to know where to even begin. Why is this a gamble effect? Would an on-field battle trick like this really be so strong that it had to have a 50% chance to backfire on you instead? Even the circumstances where you'd want this card to activate are extremely narrow. Basically, you need your opponent to be attacking your low defense but high attack monster with a smaller monster for it to even be useful at all. But why is your high attack monster in defense position during your opponent's battle phase in the first place? The idea is probably to combo this with cards like Goblin Attack Force and the like, since they force themselves to change battle positions after they battle. But why not just play final attack orders instead? You can't even set your beaters to catch your opponent by surprise, since this card only works on face-up defense position monsters. It can't even be used to play around your opponent changing your monster's positions most of the time, since if they either flip it face down or change it after the attack declaration, you can't trigger this card. Even if you could, it would still only have a 50% shot at working, with a hefty amount of damage in store for you if you failed to flip. There are many puzzling things with this card, the biggest of which is why anyone would ever dream of putting this in their deck. And at number 5, we have Toon Defense. This is a continuous trap which allows you to make an attack a direct attack instead whenever an opponent declares an attack against a face-up level 4 or lower Toon monster you control. You've probably heard several times that life points are just a resource to be used, but letting your face get beaten in to protect your small monsters is probably one of the worst ways to use them. This will help you keep your level 4 or lower Toons from being destroyed by battle in the turn they have summoning sickness, yeah, but you don't need to be told by now there are a million better ways to stop attacks. There are very few low-level Toons in the first place, in the classic era at least, and they aren't exactly winning the game if they stick around for a turn because of this. The best of them are probably Toon Gemini Elf and Toon Mass Sorcerer, since they discard a card from your opponent and draw you one respectively if they damage an opponent. But if you're counting on protecting them with this and get hit by some removal yourself, you'd be the one reeling. However, what even was the point of wasting cardboarded ink on printing this card when Astral Barrier exists, which lets you turn any attack on any monster into a direct one with no conditions whatsoever? Sure, this does mean it can be searched with Toon Table of Contents, but having extra copies of Toon Defense in your deck is hardly anything to be excited about. Toons have never been a viable archetype in the history of Yu-Gi-Oh!, in no small part due to how crappy support like this is. And at number 4, we have Seismic Shockwave. This card can only be activated when a dinosaur you control is destroyed and sent to the grave, except during the damage step. On activation, you select 3 of your opponent's unused spell and trap card zones, and prevents them from being used while this card is face up on the field. After the 3rd standby phase after this card was activated, it destroys itself, and then you can target and add back a dinosaur monster from your graveyard to your hand. This card is an extremely weird mix of ground collapse and monster reincarnation, and it's certainly just as playable as the former and not the latter. If this was all this card did, it would still be pretty darn near unplayable. Clogging up zones is something that usually doesn't matter unless you can lock them all out like Kashtira did. If it affected monster zones instead, that would at least make a combo with the much better Odama Trio or the same ground collapse to prevent your opponent from using monsters. But as it is, the only way for this card to be impactful enough would be if you managed to have 2 copies of it up at the same time. Still, even if you do have 2 copies of the card, you might not even be able to activate them, as you need your dinosaur to be destroyed. This would be annoying, but at least easy enough if getting them beaten over by battle was enough. But this card can't trigger during the damage step, so that's a no-go. And even if you do manage to trigger it and lock your opponent down, they made sure all of this goes away after 3 turns anyway. You don't even get to special summon the dinosaur back when that happens. It just goes back to your hand, as if this card would be too overpowered otherwise. And at number 3, we've got Natural Disaster. This trap card makes it so your opponent takes 500 damage each time a card they control is destroyed and sent to the graveyard by the effect of a Cloudian monster. This is one of the cards you can just tell at first glance was made to show up in a single episode of the anime, and there was no thought given to it after that. In the show, it did 100 less damage, but when you consider they also had 4,000 starting life points there, that could hardly be called a buff. This card just does nothing to support the archetype it's in, whose main gimmick is supposed to be fog counters and not destroying cards by effect in the first place. It doesn't even give you a proper payoff for doing so. While there are some Cloudians that can destroy your opponent's cards, you're going to be lucky if you manage to take out more than 1,000 damage from this card in any given duel. It doesn't even help much that Cloudians is already a terrible deck too, though that's pretty much a given for a GX era anime archetype that's not called Hero. They couldn't even give this card a slight boost and let it work with a Cloudian gimmick, where they destroy themselves when changed to defense position, by making it burn only when your opponent's cards are destroyed. At the very least, this card not having Clouding in its name does not make it any less searchable within its own deck, because Cloudians are so terrible they never had spell trap card searchers in the first place. And at number 2, we have Call of Darkness. This continuous trap sends any monster special summoned by Monster Reborn to the graveyard. Additionally, as long as this card remains on the field, Monster Reborn cannot be activated. There are some highly situational counters in Yu-Gi-Oh! That have seen play, but you can't really get any more situational than this. Call of Darkness can literally only be used against a single card, Monster Reborn. Granted, that's a pretty good card, but it's not something you'd want to dedicate a specific card in your deck to stop. There are many other options that can stop Monster Reborn, and way more, and even if they have more extra costs associated when doing so, they're still always going to be better than this. This card being a continuous trap is also essentially just a downside, since it means your negate can actually be stopped by Held Mystical Space Typhoon or other removal. Stopping future copies of Reborn is generally pretty worthless, since the card has been limited to 1 for us ever since it came out, so your opponent would have to find some way to recycle it for that to ever come up, which they can simply not do if they're staring down a Call of Darkness. If you look at the context of classic Yu-Gi-Oh!, this card probably only gets worse. Though Monster Reborn used to be an auto-include whenever it was legal, very often it was not, with the card being banned for several years at the time back then too. To be fair, this card will do you some good every once in a while in the right situation, which is more than can be said for our number 1 pick. And finally at number 1, we have Enervating Mist. This continuous trap has the effect to change your opponent's hand size limit to 5. Now, you can't really get more of a do-nothing-more card than this. For reference, the default hand size limit is 6, meaning that if you end your turn with 7 or more cards in hand, you need to discard until you're back down to 6. Changing it to 5 is really as small of a change as you can imagine, as the hand size limit is unlikely to come up in any given duel in the first place. The only slight use this card can have is that if you manage to have it in your opening hand, you can flip it during your opponent's first turn, and force them to play at least a single card, or they'll have to discard 1 during their end phase. And that is basically nothing. Even if they don't play anything, it's probably because they're glad they got to dump a monster of their choice from their hand. The only situation where you'd want to do this is if you're really afraid your opponent might just be passing to hit you with, say, Tragodia or Gores. But you'd be much better off having a card to actually deal with the problem rather than playing this. Pretty much the only situation where hand size limit was ever playable was with Silent Wabi, but that was more because giving your opponent a monster was really good with the now banned Mystic Mine. Enervating Mist can't even claim to at least have a good interaction with any busted cards. It's also outclassed very hard by another hand size limit card called Finite Cards, which just sets both players' hand size limits to 3, and there's nothing glamorous about being the worst of the worst. This is basically as bad as you can get while still technically hindering your opponent somehow, though anyone would be glad one of your cards is essentially a blank. Clearly, this mist isn't as debilitating as it seems in the art, and for all of that, this is the worst continuous trap card from back in the day.